Humanity is on thin ice, and that ice is melting fast.
Two new reports issue urgent calls for action as climate change heats up. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. The world is on the brink of catastrophic warming. That's the conclusion of a new report from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres delivered a blunt assessment of the challenge, calling on wealthy countries to move up their goals of achieving carbon neutrality by a decade, as close to the year 2040 as possible, in order to, as he put it, diffuse the climate time bomb. Meanwhile, the Environmental Energy Agency says that more damaging carbon dioxide was emitted last year than in any year on record in more than a century. Extreme weather events intensified last year's carbon dioxide emissions. Climate scientists warn that energy users must cut emissions dramatically to slow the dire consequences of global warming. There's a lot to talk about, so let's get straight to our panel. John Sturman is a professor and the director of the Sloan Sustainability Initiative at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Valerie Karplus served as director of the MIT Tsinghua China Energy and Climate Project. She's currently an associate professor at Carnegie Mellon University. Also with us, Michael Schenk. He's the director of engagement at the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance. And Chunghua Wu is CEO of the Beijing Future Innovation Center. And why don't I start with you? I mean, we've got these two reports, the IPCC report and the IEA report. Give us your main takeaways from both of these. What are they telling us?
I think this is a typical half of the glass empty, the other half is a full scenario. On the empty side, definitely scientists are telling us more data, information, and knowledge on the table that the situation is definitely getting worse. And if you look at the emission side, definitely, even though it's slowed growth, but somehow the emissions last year rose about 0.9% compared to 2021. And of course, as you mentioned early on, and so the emissions definitely getting to another historic level. Then on the other side, I think solutions somehow are also prominent there as well. If you look at renewable energy, look at the EV batteries, the we call clean energy technologies there. They've been invested heavily, in last year in particular, and China particularly leading the race. And that has hugely contributed actually to the much faster industrialization of clean energy technology there. So yes, on the empty side, I think there's more than ever the sense of urgency. The situation will continue to get worse. The planet continues to get warmer. But on the other side, I think we definitely have more confidence or level of confidence on the table that if decision makers make the right decision today or ambitious decisions today, we'll be able to still, turn the wave around and get into a much better situation.
Michael, on that point, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is calling on wealthier countries to move up their goals of achieving carbon neutrality. He wants them to hit this goal of 2040, as he puts it, in order to diffuse the climate time bomb. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Humanity is on thin ice, and that ice is melting fast. As today's report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, details, humans are responsible for virtually all global heating over the last 200 years. The rate of temperature rise in the last half-century is the highest in 2,000 years. Concentrations of carbon dioxide are at their highest in at least 2 million years. The climate time bomb is ticking.
It's ticking, that you've got to reverse it, but how difficult will it be to dramatically move up this timeline by 10 years, do you think?
It's not easy, and I first want to give a shout out to Secretary-General Antonio Guterres for always getting the narrative right, this ticking time bomb. He's talked about code red and that we're on a suicidal path. Humanity is, and he's even talked on the World Water Day of this vampiric, lifeblood-sucking human behavior. So props to Antonio Guterres for always getting the narrative right. Now, in terms of fast-tracking that goal, our cities around the world used to, years ago, set carbon neutrality goals of 2050, and then they ratcheted it up to 2040 and 2030, and some of our cities even having carbon neutrality goals, net zero goals of 2025. So getting that goal set earlier instead of 2050, bring it up to 2040 for some national governments and subnational governments, 2030, 2025. But our cities are rapidly realizing that goal setting is insufficient, that if we want to build the public and political will for this work, we actually have to, and this is going to sound counterintuitive, to slow down and include the publics and the policymakers and the private sector in that process, because for too long they felt not included in that conversation. So there is some slowing down by cities to better engage communities in this work. But he's right, that goal needs to be 2040 or sooner.
Michael, talk about what you're saying, though, that this narrative, he seems to be calling out everybody. Look, you got to pay attention, this is going on. And yet, as you know, breaking through the clutter is really difficult. I mean, it's a banking crisis one week, it's Trump might be indicted the next week, it's rate increases. I mean, it just seems like getting this story out there and breaking through all of this news cycle that we have is pretty difficult. What does he need to do to kind of accelerate that, and who else should be amplifying what he's having to say?
Great question. So I don't think it's more reports. You mentioned the IPCC report this week, the IEA report this month. I don't think it's more reports showing doomsday scenarios. They are real, and that is the fact, that is the data. What it is showing how life is going to be better. I think for too long, climate communicators and climate scientists have shown rightly that the data shows that we're headed towards a pretty doomsday scenario, as your images now illustrate. However, as we see in the United States, where there's this culture war over burgers and gas stoves, are you going to take away my burger? Are you going to take away my gas stove? I think there's this realization among climate influencers that we need to illustrate how this green transition, this energy transition, decarbonizing transport, buildings, energy systems, is going to make life better for people. We haven't done enough of that, and I think our national governments and subnational governments are slowly realizing that we need to tell that story too.
So, John, let me ask you about this. The IPCC report calling for even faster, deeper emission cuts by nations as quickly as possible, as we just were talking about. Can you talk to us about the gap between what's needed and what we're actually seeing at this stage?
Well, as you just heard, the gap is enormous. For years, we've known that the pledges and promises under the UN Framework Convention process, the Paris process, these are insufficient. They're not good enough to get us even to the old level of net zero by 2050, and certainly not good enough to accelerate that to 2040. We've known this for a long time. I'd like to pick up, though, on what Mike was saying and your question to him about what kind of communication with the public, not at or to the public, is needed. And I agree, doomsday scenarios are not going to help here. It's real, it's true, it's coming at us, it's happening now. But what people need is hope. And hope is not the idea that some magical new technology is going to come along and save us. It's the idea that it's not too late for everyone to take action. And the way we've approached that in our group is through interactive simulations. So everybody can go to climateinteractive.org and try this for themselves and explore and learn what kinds of actions and policies can get us on that path towards a safer future, net zero by 2040. That's what we need. And what people are going to find out, what experts know, but people need to know, is that the solutions include rapid acceleration of energy efficiency everywhere, buildings, transportation, industry, and then an even more rapid shift, as our colleague Dr. Wu was saying, to the renewables and away from coal. That's the most important thing that we have to do, that China has to do, is cut the coal down to zero as fast as possible instead of building even more new coal plants as they are currently planning to do.
Chunghwa Wu, I want to give you a chance to jump in there because, you know, doesn't China face the growing problem that everybody else has? Everybody wants their energy. And, you know, part of the problem is base load. You got to have either coal or nuclear or something that's, because the renewables are great, but the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. I mean, isn't this one of the issues that's confronting a lot of these countries right now? And do we need to get to a point where we get better battery technology? We've been talking about that for a long, long time, but it doesn't seem to be happening just yet, does it?
Well, as I mentioned, it's exciting to see the pace of progress in terms of clean energy technologies there. China in particular has been demonstrating, making the case that in terms of the possibility there, right? We need to accelerate. You need to build up industrial value chains, not only the technology part, but also industrial value chains to make sure, the technologies will be manufactured at a time at a cost affordable and also be accessible to be deployed everywhere that's necessary at this moment. China definitely faces, I call it the curse of coal. So today, particularly from energy security perspective, as well as the price of energy, we're talking about public. The public cares about the pricing, right? And particularly now with the current economic situation, inflation, jobs, whatever, somehow the public becomes more sensitive to pricing there as well. So there are very realistic challenges there in terms of really facing down and facing out the coal at this moment. But as I said, I think we need to accelerate actually the clean, we call it clean energy, revolution there. A couple of things we need to keep in mind. One, you should not just point a finger to coal. And the U.S. is leading the oil, right? Fossil fuels overall. So it's not just a coal issue, it's a fossil fuel overall. So U.S. and other countries need to take responsibility there as well. So we should not single out China as a problem. The second issue is really the geopolitics at this moment, particularly led by the U.S., right? Decoupling with China, you are literally turning the build-up capacity for accelerating clean energy transition into sort of waste because you are decoupling China because of the rivalry, the narrow-mindedness, the net zero, sort of a zero-sum game sort of thinking there. If we do not address those issues there, yes, we have the technology today, we have some sort of industrial value chains and supply capability there, but somehow the geopolitics is wasting so much of the resources and investment as well as capacity out there that needs to be seriously, examined at this moment.
Valerie, he brings up China, but it's interesting. About 6 months ago, I was at the UN, and I was talking to an official there who's involved in climate, and he said, look, all you have to do is look at the G20. As a collective, they're responsible for 80 to 85% of global emissions. They're also responsible for 80 to 85% of GDP. The answers are right there with the G20 in terms of the money to help some of these other countries come up and actually reduce their emissions, and also in terms of them bringing out their emissions as well. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Great. Yes. No, I think we have a historic opportunity actually to take a look at this problem from a collective perspective and say, look, there are opportunities to collaborate across countries, across sectors, across communities and workforce representatives, people who have not traditionally been front and center in these conversations. So I want to just reinforce and echo a lot of what my fellow panelists have said. If we look though to where these decisions need to get made, I think there is obviously the G20 bears a lot of the responsibility for the emissions, but I think it's really important that we recognize the role of the UN process and the big tent inclusive process that involves, particularly because a lot of the impacts of climate change are going to be felt and already being felt in many of the island nations and least developed countries. At the same time, we can't let that process prevent us from acting fast. I mean, you've heard time over and over in this conversation about the urgency of the problem. And so we need to be working on all fronts in multiple tracks simultaneously with an unprecedented level of multi-sector, multi-stakeholder partnerships. And I see actually great opportunities from our experiences working together with partners in China to try to think about where we have opportunities to demonstrate, to advance some of the solutions at the frontier that will be essential to addressing the climate issue.
Michael, at the close of COP26, nations adopted the Glasgow Climate Pact, as you know, aiming to turn the 2020s into a decade of climate action and support. The pact included strengthening efforts to build resilience to climate change, to curb greenhouse gas emissions, and to provide the necessary finance for both countries, reaffirming they're going to spend all this money, $100 billion annually, from developed to developing countries. But the UN Simon Steele says he sees an ongoing problem. I want to play for you what he had to say, and I want to get your reaction on the other side.
It's political will. So, as outlined in the IPCC report, the prescriptions are there. We know what needs to be done, we know who needs to do it, and we know when that needs to be done. We know that there is a significant portfolio, both on the mitigation side, on the adaptation side, of the solutions that are required to address this major deficit. What's still lacking is a political will to engage and the political will to implement those prescriptions.
Do you agree? Is it political will that's derailing things?
I teach a sustainable development class at NYU at the Center for Global Affairs, and what I talk to my students about is this. We know what the problems are, we know what the solutions are. It's building the public will, the political will, and the private sector will for this work to get those solutions done. Given that distrust is at an all-time high, if you look at Edelman's trust barometer, they're showing percentages of 63, 64% of people around the world are distrusting each other. So how do we build that social cohesion and social capital, get this work done? I think some of the narratives that UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is using is helpful. You had UNEP Director Inger Anderson on the show. She's talked about ecocides. When we talk about code red and suicidal path and ticking time bomb and vampiric lifeblood-sucking human behavior, this is helpful to build the political will, but we're seeing also cities tackle this. You mentioned Glasgow. They've engaged whole citizen assemblies to bring together their community to build the public and political will. Amsterdam, for example, had a 15% gas reduction by the end of last year in response to the war, Russian war in Ukraine, and it was in response to build the political will across Amsterdam society, big and small, corporate and civil society, to reduce gas by 15%. They were successful in doing so. It's so successful, they're thinking about ramping up and scaling out this action network because of the political will that was built. It's hard to build political will for 2040 or 2050, so I think national governments and subnational governments are forced to rethink how we mobilize and motivate that public and political will. Shorter term goals are helpful, tangible goals are helpful, goals that respond to the news cycle are helpful, goals that show how life will be better are helpful. So all of that is forcing climate influencers and climate leaders to rethink how we engage society as a whole.
John, I want to kind of maybe touch on this social cohesion theme that he was just talking about, because here you look in the United States and President Biden puts forward a kind of a green agenda, and then you have the debt ceiling crisis coming up, and you hear Republicans in the House saying they want to obliterate that. You had, of course, the Paris Agreement that Obama helped President Xi. Both of them really kind of forced that through. And then you have Trump come in office and say, nah, we don't want any part of this. So you have kind of this pendulum swinging back and forth while the clock ticks, as Guterres talks about it. What do you do about that?
So I think one thing that we need to do about that is recognize that there are immediate near-term benefits from cutting emissions in every possible way we can. Some of those benefits are going to be reduced illness and death, premature death from exposure to air pollution, most of which is caused by burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. 7 million people a year dying prematurely, according to the World Health Organization, due to air pollution. We will create jobs right here in the United States and in China and in every country in the world. The poor, the economically disadvantaged, every winter when it's cold, they have to choose between heating, eating, and treating their medical conditions. If we upgrade the efficiency of their apartments and homes, now they will be more comfortable, they'll be healthier, healthcare costs go down, labor productivity goes up, kids do better in school. These benefits will start to accrue immediately, even as we're helping reduce the harms from future climate change. So this kind of multi-solving is, I think, not only substantively important, but I think it's essential to build the public will across party lines, across the political spectrum, that things we can do today pay off privately with economic benefits and for the public health and the public welfare of the entire society and the entire world.
Chung-Hwa Woo, we just heard from Simon Steele. I had the chance to interview him at the UN General Assembly about 6 months ago, and he said 2015 he saw as a turning point, the Paris Agreement, where countries basically said, look, what we've been doing before this just isn't working. We need to do something more. You know, basically what was happening before was insufficient. Do you agree, and how much has been accomplished since the Paris Agreement?
I think we EU achieved a lot, actually, to be honest, to be fair to every country, actually, all the politicians or business leaders, actually, individuals there as well. And again, using China as an example, China has dramatically leapfrogged, much faster clean energy transition. And if you look at it today, 40% of China's electricity is generated from non-fossil fuels already, right? Yeah, coal continues to be a big part of the challenge, but in the meantime, you see the half full part of the glass. Actually, it's fascinating to see that. And if you look at the last year in particular, look at the investment in clean energy, China, is twice, the size of US plus EU combined, actually, in terms of clean energy investment. 70% of the global sort of renewable energy investments from China, right? If you look at the industrial value chains, actually, China's industrial capability has contributed, the majority, 70, 80, 90% of the, products, actually, clean energy products, not only to meet the demand domestically, but also globally there as well. So there's a huge leap, big step forward already. Now, for China, it's not really a political will issue. The will is already high up there. And also, China has already set a clear targets, pathways already, particularly reflected in the 14th five-year plan, which was worked out in the last couple of years already. So for China, it's really execute, implementation, to deploy, right? And so that's the space, actually, we are looking into, say, what are the barriers, what are the hurdles, actually, that are slowing down, actually, the delivery. As I mentioned, the decoupling, the geopolitics has played a really, really bad role in that process. It's disrupting the global value chain, and it's sort of, damming the sort of dynamics, actually, in the global market there as well. I think that's one of the major barriers the global community needs to address as much as possible if we're really serious about tackling climate change challenges today.
Valerie, according to the Global Action Project, more than half of the world's heat-trapping gases come from China, the United States, and Europe, with India not far behind. Of course, President Xi talking about hitting peak carbon emissions by 2030, reach carbon neutrality by 2060. Can you talk to us about the goals in China? How closely are they to hitting these goals? Is 2060 doable? Should it be accelerated, as some of you are asking, that these countries move a little bit quicker? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a great question. And if we look sort of back in time at the objectives that China in particular has set for itself, many of its climate goals have been achieved early. However, if we're going to collectively achieve the long-term goal, China and all countries will need to do more, significantly more than they've already been doing. Prior goals have not been enough. That's true if you're in Europe, that's true if you're in China, that's perhaps particularly true if you're in the United States. I do see some bright spots, however, and I think we've got new legislation that's giving clean energy a fighting chance and starting to make that business case for particular solutions. At the same time, Europe has long been a climate leader, significant innovation as well as initiative has come from the leadership the European Union has shown. And I would say, China, with its double-digit growth in renewable energy, is setting a great example, but there is room to do significantly more in every country to take the aspirations of the governments and translate them into action on the ground. Some of our research has shown that there are actually major challenges in getting policies implemented at the ground level, showing that business case for making those changes. And again, I think some of what we're starting to learn about how to build coalitions and bring, broaden the conversation, do good public communication, share lessons across national borders, and with those who maybe don't seem to think like us. We need to have these conversations openly and directly. And we, I think, in China, I'm starting to see more of these, progress. But then if we think, you mentioned the 2060 goal, I think one of the things our research together with Tsinghua University had shown earlier is that particularly with respect to renewables, that there was room to deploy faster and earlier in order to decarbonize more. And I think what we're seeing now is a similar kind of lesson. If we look forward, there is an opportunity to do more to move up that date from 2060, potentially with bold institutional change, leadership, and continued technological progress. And I think collaboration, it's not just one country, but I'm certainly seeing, I think, with all of the, interest in bringing forward the date from 2050 to 2040 in the rest of the world. I mean, so you look at China's leadership and say, yes, bold steps are possible there too.
Yeah, and obviously we need more bold steps from just about everybody. Michael, I want to ask you something about climate change contributing to climate change, which I really hadn't thought about this, but this article I was reading today, if you have a drought, there's not enough water for the hydropower, so in other words, you have to use the coal-fired power plant. And when you look at folks where the heat waves are occurring, people want their air conditioner on, which means that they've got to have more electricity, which means more coal being burned, which almost seems like it's this climate change loop. Can you talk about that? Because I haven't really thought about it that way.
We're definitely in the loop, and cities are balancing two areas of focus. Do we mitigate, do we reduce emissions, or do we focus on adaptation, responding to climate change? And with limited resources, cities are stuck having to choose often between the two, mitigation or adaptation. And you're noting the latter being the real focus here as climate change is contributing to climate change. I want to end, though, where you ended in terms of bold steps. Something our cities are doing to respond to everything you're talking about is stepping outside their normal business as usual and thinking outside the box and trying on new hats, new approaches. For example, Melbourne is launching a chief heat officer. And so a lot of cities around the world now have chief heat officers to send the message that we have a problem. I know people feel it in the city, in the urban, you've talked about urban heat islands before on this show, including cities hiring climate justice directors to do better at equitable inclusion of all stakeholders who should be at the table. And so you're seeing cities step out of their business as usual, outside the box thinking in terms of tackling this. I too am trying to do differently because now every day on LinkedIn, I post a positive solution in the sustainability space to counter the doomsdayism that is real and exists in response to these IPCC reports and IEA reports. So how do we step outside our own box, personally or professionally, to do things differently, because it's going to require that of us?
Well, I like leaving on the word hope, which was also mentioned earlier in the broadcast. I want to thank all four of you for joining us. It's been a great addition to The Heat. Appreciate it. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.